Alright, another draft physics video presentation. Alright, 3 videos, all on the subject of gravity, and so I'll play bits and pieces of them, and attempt to make the argument that, regular physics is cowardly. Yeah, let's call it that. There's arguments to be made, and they're just ignoring them and pretending they can just, walk away and say, we've done all we have to do. We've proven it by not proving it. And that's really the argument, that the proof is way insufficient. They haven't met their burden. They've come into court with a lousy case, and just through arrogance and pompousness and authority, wearing a really great suit and just telling the dunderheads in the jury, believe me, I'm sophisticated, I have money, I am worthy of your respect. And it's just the pretense of respectability. Look, I have fancy equations and a Lamborghini, and therefore I know what I'm doing and I'm competent. And so they don't have to have a case. They don't have to do any of the real work of putting all the things in the right order, presenting the evidence in a coherent manner. They can just fool, the doopy dopes sitting there with essentially just an appeal to their authority, and an appeal to, you're too stupid to understand, so don't bother trying. I'll just tell you what the truth is. So that's my summation. You can think of it otherwise, but that's all I see happening, is they're taking a ton of shortcuts. They just say, we did it. We don't necessarily have to prove we did it. We found this Higgs thingy. We see these gravitational waves. We do this, we do that, and just trust us. We know what we're talking about. But every now and then you see they reveal themselves for not wearing any clothes, kind of thing. They're at least wearing a skirt, with ruffles and such. And you can see that these are just tarts. It's underneath the suit. They're sissies. So anyway, not the point I'm trying to make, actually. Joke, throw it in there for fun. So when they try to assert something like, the Earth is moving out, you're not being affected by the force of gravity. You're being affected by the Earth constantly expanding in some geodesic somewhere, and that is what flattens your ass into the chair. Gravity is not a force. It's some sort of whatever a non-force would be that acts just like a force. Yeah, so whatever that is, that's what gravity is, some magical thing that just happens. So my simple argument is what you have is this simple thing. Okay, I put a thing in space. What they're saying is there's bent geodesic, whatever that is. Okay, the old bent geodesic happens now. There's a thing in space, an electron, proton, or an atom, let's say. I would say that nuclear physicists should recognize that what they really have to account for is the fact that the atom, they know it's made of at least 2 things, right? They claim there's 463 different particles that make up physics, but they kind of know, well, there's 2 really big ones, the famous ones, are electrons and protons. And the idea is what they're saying is these bits somehow are bending the geodesic, whatever that is, and that's causing this idea of inness, pull, that they're somehow they're pulling on space, okay, by just existing. I'm pulling on space by just existing, and somehow this black stuff, I'm making it in colors, but they say it's just this black nothing. This black nothing is somehow moving right into this thing's center of gravity, and right into this little thing's center of gravity. But it's this terribly weak force, so they don't say it has much to do with this fact that these 2 things are sticking to each other, or staying associated with each other. Well, we won't even get to their theory of an atom, because their theory of an atom is just stupid. So let's just say it's an atom, and we'll just draw it as a a circle and just say, okay, atom, because yes, their notion of what a thing is useless. But the idea is, okay, this thing is sucking space, and so as soon as I put something else in here, another atom thingy, that it's going to do the same thing. It's going to pull on this fabric crap and, you know, create this sucking sound like a big vacuum cleaner. Yeah, you can see that mostly. And now these two vacuum cleaners are going to suck each other into each other. So this is going to move this way, and this one's going to move this way, proportional to their masses, of course. And you know, and we're supposed to, and the sucking is proportional to the mass. You know, the bigger the thing is in terms of how many electrons and protons it has, the more it sucks. But there's just zero explanation. I mean, nothing. There's no the force is godlike. This magical fact that this magical substance of space is somehow magically affected, and it's not bent space in the sense that this stupid bent crap doesn't work in 3 dimensions. That's not a 3-dimensional bend. In 3 dimensions, bending essentially looks like, you know, a bunch of spokes sticking out in all 3 dimensions. You know, spokes out this way, spokes this way, spokes, a whole bunch of arrows pointing in. That's what it looks like in 3 dimensions. It's just a vacuum cleaner in the center of the object sucking, you know, the magic stuff, causing the magical effect of pulling towards each other. All right, but the fact is that this thing does move this way, and this thing does move that way, and in space, and that's what's going to really happen. And this saying that somehow this thing didn't move or this thing didn't move, that somehow space just disappeared, you know, some kind of, I don't know. I mean, it's a silly to say there's not a force, in the sense that it obviously behaves just like a force, and just like the other forces. Let's recognize again, this bent space stuff moves exactly the same speed as photons. You know, exactly the same speed as magnetism. You know, in terms of opposing its effect. And you don't think magnetism is some bent, fieldy, spacey thing, do you? Really? You know, it's all made out of this magical nothing. This, I sense your presence by the magical thing moving the speed of light, not moving instantaneous. No, moving the speed of light. I sense you with my, you know, my ESP that's a little bit slow. You know, it doesn't. My ESP doesn't move the speed of light. It doesn't move instantaneously. It slows down to imitate the other forces, the other things they still calling a force. Now maybe this guy will call all the other forces magnetism, and, well, you know, electricity really isn't a force. There's just charge. Okay, there's charges, and you put 2 charges next to each other. You know, electron and proton. It's a dipole. That's right, and that's magnetism. But anyway, I've said enough. Preposterous to sit there and assert that this is a easily defended theory of the magical nothing, okay, that is bent and changed, and somehow by changing the nothing, I move things, and I don't have to push them, I don't have to pull them, they just move. Alright, so we'll play some of each of these videos and deal with it.
Some people attacked my recent video, Gravity is Not a Force and the Acceleration is Upwards, as pseudoscience garbage.
Right. Well, I don't know if I use that word, but it's garbage. Okay, as a way of understanding, it's garbage. All right. As getting to the real facts and the real truth, it's garbage. In acknowledging the other evidence on the table, it's garbage.
There were also at least 2 rebuttal videos.
Yes, he didn't play a clip from mine. But he plays desert files. This is somebody from my long past who mostly made atheist videos in the past, but, you know, he's some sort of stupid cow farmer, which really is irritating. But anyway, lives in the desert, does wacky desert stuff, so he is a bit of a character, you know, a little bit eccentric. Um, so we all have some of that, maybe. Um, so he plays a millisecond of his video.
The planet Earth is not accelerating upward.
But Albert Einstein.
So that's all the argument he accepts from the contenders. So he presents our evidence by just going, look, it's evidence. No, stop looking at it. Don't pay attention to any of their arguments. Don't specifically address any of their arguments. Just re-argue your bibble-babble from your authority. Look, I made a device that calculates gravity. Therefore, I've proven gravity is an invisible ESP force between electrons and protons. And, anything material has ESP. And knows it should go somewhere with its little... And it turns on its go motor. It has a little motor just for this case, right? I have gotten the signal. The geodesic is bent. Therefore, I should turn on my motor and move. I mean, where's the energy come from? I mean, I've made these appeals to before. Nobody ever explains it. No energy for gravity, no energy for magnetism, right? You clearly see the magnets move. They do something. Boom, smash right into each other. Or they, you try to push them together and they won't push together. Where does the energy come from? I'm putting force. I'm using energy to push them together, and they are repelling me. Well, what are they repelling me with? ESP? No, I don't want to. That's good enough for you as an explanation? That's physics? Shit.
Einstein's general relativity describes gravity as something other than a force. And it's easy to show.
No, it's really not, okay? Einstein's own words, well, we're not calling it ether. Okay, I'm paraphrasing. We're not calling it ether, but duh, it has to be an ether, right? Own up to what Einstein actually said instead of pretending that he didn't have any explanation and just said, oh, I told you how invisible the force is. I don't have to tell you anything else. It's just magical. There, haven't I done my job? It's a dumb idea. Yes, Einstein was dumb, but it wasn't as dumb as you're making him out to be.
That no force makes an object fall.
Ugh. Yeah, right. Nothing happened.
And that the acceleration of gravity really is upwards.
So, again, as the Desert File points out, this is stupid jargon. It's just insanely stupid. Okay, the ground doesn't accelerate upwards any more than in the fact that obviously the ground is pushing upwards. Okay, if I dent it, it says no, I don't wish to be dented, and hits me with an equal and opposite force. That's why your ass gets flat when you sit down, is because the ground is saying fuck you. All right, it's pushing back. Now, if it's pushing back, that's a real force of pushing back. It's really happening in the earth. The stuff on the surface of the earth is on the surface of the earth, not because that's where, it's really cool to be. It's because it's being pushed there by the fact that the interior of the earth is molten and the earth is full of a bunch of matter that has moved towards each other so close that it can't get any closer without the ping pong paddle scenario of the pressure pushing it the opposite direction. So we clearly see the opposite reaction. It's right in front of you. But the action is also obvious that it has to be there. There has to be something pushing us down. So we're getting pushed down and there's an opposite force pushing us back. Duh. The simple explanation. The earth isn't moving anywhere, just as we're not moving anywhere, in the sense of we, the big giant thing. But we as a composite of little things, obviously the things where you're sitting or standing, okay, the bottom of your feet or the bottom of your ass, those things are getting actively moved. And they're essentially, one moment in time, they might be going this way, and the next moment in time, they're doing that way. You're being jiggled on the surface of the earth by two counter forces that are really just the same force of gravity. The Earth is being pushed in both directions at all times. All right, let's play some of the desert file.
I give up again. Which direction is downward? Which direction in this image is upward? And which direction in this image is downward? Good bloody gods.
But now suppose that we fire up an engine and begin to accelerate in one direction. From inside our spaceship, now things have changed.
Right, so he's doing the same thing he did in his other video. The thing I pointed out is just nonsense. And the apple in this state, he says this is its inertial state. But the apple is saying, I'm being pushed in just one direction. It feels that.
We can tell that
I mean, it's being pushed in the two directions in the sense the force, okay, is pushing it because the rocket is moving, right? And the counter force is its own mass, saying, I don't want to move.
we're no longer in an inertial reference frame. If we release an object, it begins to move, as if a force is acting on it. It accelerates.
Right. Well, the object didn't accelerate. So this will go to Desert File's next point when this guy starts talking about what Einstein is saying and what the theory says. There's the idea isn't that you sit there and say, what am I seeing? Do I see an apple moving? Yeah, that's what you see. But what's really moving is the rocket and the man. And the apple is now being released from being pushed by the rocket. And you have to understand the rocket is constantly accelerating. So it's not just the rocket is moving at a set speed, like it's going 50 miles an hour. No, each second it's going, by gravity, 10 meters per second acceleration. So it's accelerating constantly. It's constantly going faster and faster and faster and faster. So when the apple was in the man's hand, the apple wasn't free. They weren't like in space with zero gravity or something. The apple you couldn't just move your hand and the apple maintains its velocity. No, the apple is going, say, 500 miles an hour, but the spaceship is now going 525, and then it's going 550, and then it's going 575. So the rocket ship is speeding away from the apple, period. Perception isn't reality. Perception happens at the speed of light, right? So you could have one mother-in-law over there, you could have your mother-in-law, and you could have your mother over there, and they could be nagging you about something, and if you move towards one or away from the other, you could realize that, gee, this one seems so much more naggy, okay, because it got all these new complaints, but you haven't heard the complaints from the other side yet, okay, because you moved away, so they're delayed. So you have this impression of something, but your impression doesn't have anything to do with the reality. You've just changed your position in space. Well, not the best analogy,
But no such force actually exists.
So again, he says no force causing the object to accelerate. So again, he's saying we're too stupid to figure out, well, the apple isn't the thing with the flaming motor on it. Okay, it's not the thing moving now. The thing moving is the rocket and the man standing on the floor. He's the one obligated to move because a force is pushing him from the bottom of his feet. All right, yeah, that's actually happening because it's a big giant rocket engine. Pathetically bad.
Use the force on the rocket.
Yeah, so Desert File circles it and points out here is the force. Yes, and the apple doesn't have a big flame. So yeah, the apple is an illusion. The apple isn't doing the moving. All right, but that doesn't have anything to do with what's happening here on Earth in the sense that we're still in the guy's hand. And yes, if I remove the hand, what we have to account for is the fact that we're in gravity. Unlike the rocket. The rocket's not supposed to be moving in any gravitational field. Well, we're in a gravitational field, and clearly we do fall. And we fall because there's a force pushing us down. Pushing, right? Pulling is kind of silly. I mean, anybody who can't admit, I mean, if you're so dishonest and so intellectually dishonest that you can't admit, at least, that yes, push is intrinsically and fundamentally and profoundly more simple an idea than a pull. You know, push is just too simple and pull is too complex. Now, if you're not willing to admit that that's true, you know, that's the context in which all this babble has to be spoken, is the context of knowledge, clear knowledge, that push is really easy. I pushed it. You know, you just throw something, you pushed it. Push is so easy, and pull is, well, how the hell do I do that?
The object is just floating freely, and the spaceship is speeding up around it.
Yes, and that's the only forces you have in this picture. But if you had gravity in the picture, the apple could be moving sideways. The apple could be doing lots of other things based on the other forces you put in the equation. And again, the argument isn't that there's that the force of gravity doesn't exist when we're stuck in it. When we're sitting here right on the Earth, you see your ass flatten. You can feel the bones jiggling and redefining the pressure points and all of that. You can tell that there's a counter force. You're not free falling when you're stuck, okay? When there's stuff under you, stopping you from moving. Ugh.
And it is doing so with a force.
One of Einstein's brilliant realizations is that you cannot distinguish between being accelerated in one direction and being under the influence of gravity. From inside an elevator car, you couldn't tell whether it's sitting on the surface of the Earth or in deep space and being accelerated in the direction of the ceiling by 9.8 meters per second.
Right, and this equivalency principle, again, I've argued, it was completely unnecessary, something Einstein didn't need to step into this mess. And he made this bold assertion that it's impossible. And yet he was thoughtful enough to have thought about it enough to realize that there was one test that kind of gave it away. You know, where if you were in a rocket, you would be able to do one test, and that test would demonstrate how fast you were going. And I'm going to wait for that to dry, actually. So we'll pause for a second. Or a moment. I'm back. So the short spiel on the equivalency principle, again, for context. So Einstein's thought experiment, yes, is this elevator or rocket ship or whatever you want to make it. And the idea was to create a light clock, a clock that sends photons to a mirror, and the photons bounce back and forth. And you could use such a device if you use such a device in something moving through space. The idea would be is as you increase your speed to half the speed of light or some other kind of ridiculous speed, that what you would see in the ship is that this light clock would tend to break, in a sense, that the mirror would be moving down as it would appear to you, okay, in the sense that the light, well, the mirror wouldn't move down because the mirror is moving with the ship, sorry to imply that. And in fact, your light clock would break because the photon would continue on its path in a straight line, but the ship would be moving up, so it would appear as if the photon was doing this and it hit the wall here. Obviously, you'd have to have a mirror longer, and you'd have to have some way, because the photon would essentially, as the ship moves, the photon would be going in straight lines, and the straight lines would end up doing some sort of, going down the ship kind of thing, down the wall of the ship. And so, to make his equivalency principle work, see now, obviously, I would argue that this is where Einstein's proven wrong by his own thought experiment, because the thought experiment demonstrates that in the ship you will see something happen that will essentially be a speedometer. That is, the light clock will provide you a constant, and your ship's movement will provide you a moving reference, and the fact is you'll be able to use it as a speedometer. It will tell you exactly how fast you're going, because how much the light bends down the ship will be telling you how fast your ship is going. So it's a speedometer, and now you can do a test to test where your velocity is coming from, essentially. So anyway, so the trick is that Einstein, because he had to make things equivalent, all right, he broke logic by saying, okay, well, I have to make the same thing happen to photons in gravity. So I have to make photons bend in gravity so they look like the spaceship. Because I have to make these two forces equal. I have to make the force this way equal to the force of gravity this way in terms of how the photons appear. So I have to make the ones on the Earth appear the same as these when it's not the same circumstance. And the photons in this case didn't move, didn't bend, and now he's bending them on the Earth. So he's making the photons do the bending on Earth, where the ship forced the bending by moving away from the photons in this case. They're not equivalent. It's not the same thing. You could tell the difference. If you build the light clock, put it in a spaceship, and move this fast, you will see how fast you're going. It will reveal, the light clock will reveal your velocity, but it can only work when you're going very, very fast, because otherwise you need a light clock that's incredibly long, miles and miles long. Without a light clock miles long, you don't have much hope of seeing slow velocities. In terms of, you don't have much hope of seeing the fact that the photons won't be able to hit, okay, the surfaces, because the surfaces will be moving. All right, in the same way. So that's the basic principle. It's nonsense. Einstein should have never gone there. And what we get as a byproduct is a bunch of really weak evidence experiments that are terribly poor. The Eddington experiment never redone. They never done it from space. And the rest of it is a bunch of what they claim to be galactic style lensing images that have no mathematical coherency. They don't make any sense, really. They're broken all over the place, wobbly, fuzzy. They're breaking mathematical rules they have to obey. And physics won't even admit this. And it's glaringly obvious that there's no way gigantic objects lack spherical symmetry. And so the images should also have spherical symmetry. There's no excuse for why the symmetry is broken all over the place. No explanation. Except, they're going to sit there and force smoke rings, that can be wobbled. The leftovers from a supernova, and claim it's a lens image. When it's clearly, you can look at it and say, logically deduce, no, that's actual stuff that was blown apart because it has changes in its density. Another thing a lensed image won't do is be bright in one spot and dull in another spot and bright, and no, none of that stuff would happen. Well, anyway, tons of incoherency. I've pointed out it's the wrong shaped lens. The whole theory makes no sense at all, and yet they assert it like it's the purest, most developed theory in the history of mankind, when it's clearly completely incoherent, in many ways incomprehensible to simple or basic logic, and the evidence is contradictory. And yet they assert it as we've proven our case. And they haven't come close to the burden of proof. They just are so preposterously arrogant, and all the little minions, all the little defenders of the nerdy geeks, just keep applauding them and keep supporting them and keep holding them up like little, it's a religion.
Where?
Albert Einstein's principle of equivalency is not prescriptive. It is,
and it's not even descriptive, in the sense that the perceptions aren't consistent or accurate. He concedes in one case the photons are moving straight. They aren't affected by, there's clearly no gravity in the rocket ship. But clearly this idea that the photons are the indestructible thing. You can't change them. You can't give them two momentums. You can't shoot them out of a gun, move the gun and shoot the photon faster. You can't slow the photons down. All you can do is change distance between objects that are emitting photons. The photons are always the same. Always. So he gets that part and then he throws it away by saying gravity bends them all over the place. It's just nonsense.
Descriptive. It is not how reality works. It is how reality is perceived.
And it's only perceived from a certain point of view. So again, if you were not moving with the ship and you were standing still with the photons, in the sense that you weren't with the ship moving, you'd clearly see, yes, the photons are doing exactly what they're supposed to do, which is go from point A to point B in a straight line. So it's not even perception, it's perception from some human-centric or from some human-contrived perspective, where, again, two simultaneous events happen, and because I move closer to one or closer to the other, that somehow now I have some notion that there might be some possibility that they're not simultaneous anymore, that they didn't really happen at the same time, that somehow I'm changing their reality because I'm in a different position looking at them, and it takes time for the light to get to me. I mean, it is such a bad theory. It's a concept that physics just should say, no, let's just, no. No, let's just say no. Just say no to bullshit. Equivalency is bullshit. Different forces affect things in different ways. A hammer is different than a tsunami, is different than a tiny force bits that could go right through objects and, move them with tiny amount of interactions. I mean, X-rays are different than tsunamis, than hammers, than blow torches, and blah 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 blah. Why play this game that it's all the same? All motion is not caused by the same event.
Different things entirely. The planet Earth is not accelerating upward.
Yeah, it is. Okay, technically, okay, it is in the sense that if we say up and down, no matter what the orientation is, I mean, the basic point is, yeah, it's a valid statement, but it has to be valid in a context, okay, that if there's an up, there's a down. And the simple argument is, is that the Earth is sitting here, you stand on it on this side, okay, over here, and the other guy on the other side is standing on it over here. All right, I mostly see that. But the real point is that even without these people on here, the idea is there's a force heading in this way, and it's heading in all directions. So just assume this line is the same is true for every other line I could draw for up and down. So we're going to make left and right, up and down. I guess I could have just done it up and down, but fuck it. So what's really happening is the forces coming in from both sides, okay, the universe is pushing. All right, and the simple explanation is it's absorbing some of this going this way, and it's absorbing some of this going this way. So from this guy's perspective, this force is pushing him back up. This one can't be relevant, right? It's going the wrong way. It certainly can't affect him anymore. But this one, the one absorbed this way, can affect him in the sense that this piece of energy that was moving here, it was going for him. It was absorbed by the Earth. So now the Earth, pieces of the Earth are now moving this way. Okay, so pieces of the Earth, the ground below me, is moving towards me. And the force, though, is hitting me in the head, okay? The whole force. And it's pushing me this way. So in a sense, the Earth is pushing you, and it's pushing you in both directions. The Earth is pushing you this way, the force of gravity is pushing you down, and you stay here. You don't go anywhere. And the same thing's happening to this guy with exactly the opposite dynamic. And the Earth has got a bunch of swirly hot stuff in the middle because of a consequence of this. This absorption and this absorption means this stuff, okay, is going to get hot because there's two opposite forces going opposite directions. It's being sheared and torn apart, heated, okay, by the very fact that it's got this happening in all these directions. All these directions, it has these two forces going opposite directions. So each pieces of it are going, this little piece ends up going this way. This little piece ends up going that way. All the pieces are being moved by an actual force, an actual pressure that's coming from the outside in. Push, 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 push. Pull is religion. Desert File. I'd like to. I wonder if Desert File would make a reply. I'll see if I can post. I'll post a link to my video and see if he replies. I mean, do you believe in their nonsense woo forces? I mean, there's no point in saying gravity is a force when you don't explain what a force is. I mean, what is a force? If a force can be invisible motivation, I'm motivated by magic. Okay, you're basically giving matter some kind of free will. You're giving little matter bits some sort of will, and the matter bit, the geodesic sends a ESP signal that the space is bent. Why no? He's saying no. There's no space. How can space be bent? I'm all alone here. No, it's bent. Trust me, it's bent. You now need to have the will to move. Oh, come on.
What direction again is up?
Einstein realized
Well, the opposite of down, so that's one way to figure it out.
that rather than gravity being a force acting at a distance that accelerates freely moving objects downward, we have to say that instead,
No, we have to say that. No, you don't have to do it. You don't have to buy this nonsense, okay? That you have to go with your perception. You have to go with what you see. Something else moved and you don't feel that you're moving. Well, the fact that you don't feel it doesn't mean that you're not doing it. Right? I mean, we feel gravity, okay, when it's stopping, when we're being stopped. You know, and we don't feel it when we move the opposite force. Well, that sort of makes sense because I'm not being compressed by the opposite force anymore. There's no obstacle, so how can I feel the non-obstacle? Why would I feel an obstacle if there's no obstacle? Clearly we feel gravity when there's an obstacle that makes it visible. We can't see it if it doesn't hit anything, right?
gravity puts us in a non-inertial accelerated reference frame. And we have to say that the surface is what's being accelerated.
We don't have to say that. But of course it is. That's why we're not moving. That's why we're staying a certain distance from the center of the Earth. It's because there's a force pushing us back.
Upward.
No, Albert Einstein did not realize that, and we do not have to say Earth is accelerating upward.
Okay. So we'll just stick with the prescriptive part. That was the best part of this video, I would argue. So we'll go back to the other guy. Well, maybe we'll play the in-between, right? Okay. So he says experimental proof. So all he's using is a gravitometer or whatever, accelerometer, right? And so it's working on the same principle. There's just a little person in it on a string, so to speak, and you just move the object and you see if the person on a string moves, you know. So it really can't, it's only, again, comparing your inertial state in the sense of your state of being affected by gravity. The accelerometer can't eliminate gravity and give you an actual description of space, okay, the real description. It's stuck in the same thing. It has a perspective. The accelerometer has just as much a perspective that we have, okay? It gets hit from the bottom. It feels gravity when there's an obstacle to the gravity, and it doesn't feel it when there's no obstacle to it. So again, it's in the same condition. You can't flatten its ass with magic. You have to flatten its ass with a chair. So it doesn't prove anything. It's just changing the location of where you put the human. You just put the human in a different box, and you're saying, well, here's exactly the same circumstances. There's a human inside a box with a chair. I'll call that an accelerometer. I mean, it's not a proof of anything. There's no elemental physics in this video. He's not going to give any elemental explanation. He's not going to explain why an electron and a proton sitting inside of us right now, okay, if the chair disappears and the floor disappears and I start falling into the center of the Earth, he's not going to give you an description of what's motivating the electrons and protons to move, or the Earth to move past me. He's not going to give you an explanation for how they're moving and how their movement in absolute space, how they're moving in absolute space. There won't be any explanation for how it's possible to describe the Earth moving.
I've loaded my phone with an accelerometer app and attached it to a camera. Here are the axes of this setup.
So I'll give him some credit for trying to defend his mush in the sense that, okay, he's trying to do an experiment. Great. I mean, he goes through the effort and the work to load the stupid app, which probably was annoying, and having the accelerometer and all this crap. But again, it doesn't demonstrate anything new. I could do this with a cat. I could do it with a mushroom. I mean, a bowl of Jell-O, okay, could suffice. I don't need an accelerometer to be able to create, like I said, liquids, for example, will show you. You can just watch what they're doing, and you can see they're not or are moving.
Y and Z. When I accelerate the system in the positive direction along an axis, I get a positive acceleration reading in that direction.
Right, that's because the chair hit the ass. It doesn't demonstrate anything. You've met a force with a counter force. That's when the force is visible. The force is not visible unless there's some force acting against it. Then the force is hard to see. Okay, but it's easy to see if you understand, oh, it's just going with the flow of the force. It's being free to move along. Being free to move along, okay, is not disruptive. But clearly it is to human beings, because guess what? It takes a while for the force to get through us. So if we have a rocket engine and it's pushing you, again, I made these points. The astronaut is sitting down, lying down for a good reason, because if he was standing up, the acceleration would put in tremendous stress on his legs, because it's a smaller points that all the pressure has to go through, and all of your atoms have to be bang into each other to get the force through you. The rocket engine, unlike gravity, rocket engines aren't affecting each little atom in your body, where gravity is. Gravity is pushing on your atoms. It's not pushing on you, the physical big thing. It's pushing on the atoms. The littlest bits inside of you are getting pushed, each one of them. And so that force goes through you really efficiently, where a force pushing you in a rocket engine is incredibly inefficient. It takes a great deal of time for all of your bits to smash into each other. And all of that smashing is destructive. That's why you can't accelerate humans freely. You can't just accelerate them and, well, they don't feel anything. Of course they're going to feel something, because their body is going to start falling apart.
Sitting on a surface, it says that it's accelerating at 1g, 9.8 meters per second squared. Yet, unlike a car speeding up, it isn't going anywhere. Now let's see what happens.
So again, the fact that it's not going anywhere, just like us not going anywhere, doesn't mean we're not being acted on by forces. It just means the two forces, the one pushing me up, equals the one pushing me down.
When I drop it, it registers 0 acceleration as it's falling.
So again, it just has nothing to do with measuring anything real, in the sense that it's just measuring merely because there's no chair, there's no scale. You're removing the scale, okay? I am weighing you, right? And then I remove the scale, okay? You don't really fall, because let's say the scale is really micro thin, all right? And I remove the scale, you tiny little jolt maybe, you don't notice. Well, I don't even know how to say that. Regardless, the fact that the scale reads 0 when I'm not measuring you, right, isn't a big surprise. And that's all this is saying. It's saying, well, what are you reading? What's the scale say when I allow you to fall off the scale? There's no counter force. So it's not measuring the real force acting on the iPhone or whatever. There's no real force being measured here. The device is incapable of measuring the real force, because the only way it can measure a force is to have the force hit something. The detector has to be hit by it for it to measure it. If the detector moves, it can't measure the non-existent consequence.
Newton's second law of motion says that force equals mass times acceleration. So, if the acceleration measurement is 0, then any measurable forces acting on the phone must also...
Just terrible. Just terrible, terrible perversion of a mathematical equation, because it's not supposed to be done backwards. It's supposed to be done forwards. Okay, so again, the force acting on it, that equation is meant to measure things in one circumstance, when you have a known acceleration, a free acceleration, not when you're measuring two cars smashing into each other. You're not allowed to say there's no velocity where the two cars meet, right? There's zero velocity at the impact. So you're allowed to say, therefore, there's no mass, there's no no velocity, no anything, so I could just make it zero. No, you have to account for what they were doing before they had zero acceleration and zero velocity. You can't pretend they didn't have one before. And so when two forces interact, yes, there's zero motion. Doesn't mean that there's zero force. It means there's two forces. And gravity obviously has symmetry. There's just as much of it coming from the bottom. There's just as much pressure being absorbed, momentum going that way, as there is force hitting me this way. And the momentum going this way, pushing up, okay, came from where? Oh, that's right, the force of gravity on the other side of the Earth pushing down, down from its perspective. But you can't say there's no force. You think there's no force in the center of the Earth? Is that what you would say? There's no force in the center of the Earth. I can go to the center of the Earth and there's no force. It's like the gravity example of the hollow Earth, right? And you get the idea that yes, you will be affected by no gravity. So here you are. There's matter on this side of you. You're right next to it, right? The crust. You're inside the Earth, right? And there's a roof, a ceiling around the whole thing. You're inside a ball, and you're right next to this hunk of mass. And then you're a little far away from the rest of this stuff. But anyway, it's mass right there. You can see it. And you're saying that, well, the gravitational force is a real thing. You know it. I mean, there's a real thing called gravity. So I have to be being affected by something. And the simple argument is, yeah, the massive amount of stuff out there is further away. So it's got a lot of mass, but it's far away. And the stuff right next to me has a little bit of mass, but it's really, really close. And those two things exactly equal. And so I am, in fact, being pulled towards this surface, but I'm also being pulled away, okay? Pulled in the sense of the inverse push. I'm both being pushed towards this surface and I'm being pushed towards that surface. And the two forces are equal and opposite. And Newton's equation wasn't meant to deal with equally and opposite forces that have been counteracted by being equal and opposite. It doesn't mean there's no force. It means there's no movement. I mean, it should be more explicitly stated that a moving force, a force that will cause movement, is what the real F stands for.
Be zero. Gravity must not be a force, but causes the phone to fall to the floor.
So again, he says this is a proof again. So pulling the scale out from under somebody and saying, look, it's read zero. No, that's not a proof. That the thing doesn't weigh anything. Anyway, so yes, so we'll play something else. Play some of this Feynman stuff. All right, so this is the Zohar Kohevi. Yeah, there we go. Getting there. Anyway, I don't agree with everything he says in this video. I'll leave a link below, and I've already played the Feynman clip, and first off, he's defending Lesage gravitational model, and Feynman is debunking essentially that model. But that model is a little bit incomplete in the sense that it's just the basics of the model. It doesn't provide for charge and the other phenomena we see, and so I would say it needed to be improved as I've improved it, and so now it's a more viable explanation, clearly. And and again, it's not really Lesage gravity, it's Fadio gravity, and I don't know how much Lesage really improved on what Fadio had argued. But you can't really get too much of original papers and all that stuff, and it's in the wrong language and whatever. I don't know if Fadio came up with ultramundane particles, so that might have been something Lesage added. Obviously, Lesage did draw some images of it, so he made better illustrations of it. And I don't even know if I buy this argument that Newton hated it or something. No, Newton signed Fadio's paper, so he did, for some number of years, him and Fadio were in communication with each other, so clearly there wasn't, it wasn't until later that Newton concluded it doesn't work. So it's not like Newton didn't think about it. And they were making the same mistake, right? I mean, you see a fact and you say, well, there's an inconsistency, right? The idea of this particle field does destroy motion. It causes drag. And so you do have to explain how that drag is made irrelevant, how it's compensated for by actual mechanisms. And I've done some of that. But anyway, yeah, I don't necessarily agree with everything stated in this video.
Since, like 50 years ago, he won a Nobel Prize. And he actually is one of the very, very, very few people that I've seen talking about Lesage's theory of gravitation. So Lesage's theory is actually what I've been talking about in this channel mostly.
And yeah, then unfortunately, like, he never even called it that. He didn't even state that this is a 300-year-old counter argument to their relativity bent space physics, and that it does work quite perfectly to explain the functions that we see in gravity, and that its only flaw is this one regarding the resistance to velocity, in the sense that it would drag everything to a halt. If they, like I said, if you don't have a mechanism that explains why drag becomes irrelevant.
It's basically just a theory that was supposed to explain why gravity happened. Actually, Lesage came up with this theory like 300 years ago.
So again, it was Fadio who came up with it 300 years ago, and 200 years ago Lesage, after Newton, somewhere after Newton, improved it. So Fadio was Newton's time, Lesage was after Newton.
And everyone just made fun of him for it, and pretty much no one accepted the theory. They talked shit about him behind his back. I think Isaac Newton just laughed at him behind his back.
So again, it says right here, laughed at Mr. Fadio's manner of explaining gravity. You know, that's Haley. Yeah, well, lots of them said it's got a problem. Okay, first they also didn't understand. You know, they were thinking of these things as being rocks, and that rocks hit things and rocks break into pieces and all of that kind of stuff. So they weren't really thinking of photons as indestructible pieces of momentum that might be absorbed. So another thing to understand is they had no concept of absorption. So the simple argument I've made of understanding that force gets trapped, okay, that it can go into a system and be stuck in the system, that it can end up just going around in a circle. And as a force, as a thing moving, if it's caught in a circle that's for free, and it can just stay in that circle forever, obviously it's not getting where it's supposed to go. And they didn't really have a way of understanding that mechanism, that you could have this idea of the simple geometry could be made of something where, yes, you can turn right, and right can be up, or right can be that way, right can be different things in the 3 dimensions. So I'm just saying they did had a very incomplete understanding, and they didn't recognize that this is a theory in an incomplete form, and that maybe if they work on it a little bit, they could complete it. And they just didn't want to. And instead, they stuck themselves to a theory they can never complete. You know, they chose one they'll never fix, which is the wooey bent space magical force theory. Instead of coming up with physical reasons why things happen, they kind of just, and again, it wasn't Newton's fault. He said, I don't know how gravity works. But he clearly did say it would be silly to think it's just some magical force. It just magically does it. There's got to be some physics. He just said, I don't know what the physics is.
And here's Euler just telling him he basically told him, like, your theory is kind of disgusting to me, it's repugnant, you know. and I'd rather just be ignorant and just tell everyone I have no idea how gravity works, rather than just going to that theory, and he calls it a strange theory. So yeah, there's that, like everybody who sees this theory seems to have just like, be very skeptical of it, right? Maybe a little too skeptical. So anyways, here's Richard Feynman talking about it, and he actually does an extremely good job explaining everything.
Perhaps you've thought of it yourself. Every once in a while, some student comes running in and he suddenly explains gravitation.
Right. Well, to those critics, I mean, it's obviously more than Fadio or Lesage could have thought of it. I mean, Lesage didn't think of it. He actually thought Fadio was correct and purchased the rights to Fadio's work and continued it after his death, essentially. But again, the idea that you have to come up with an accountable mechanism, a physical mechanism causing the effect, and the simple idea that everything is being pushed, that there is something in the universe, okay, this invisible photons, these pieces of photon, and that force is accounting for what you see in gravity. And then I argue simply that a magnet is just filtering that force, because the force does have two variants, an electron force and a proton force. It accounts for charge, and if you just think of the charged particles essentially being filters, and when they're put in a dipole, they filter in a specific way, you can account for all of what they call fields. And you don't have to believe in antiparticles and entanglement and all kinds of the other woo. It's all completely unnecessary. You don't have to think of time as a dimension. None of that stuff has to happen. It's all just storytelling, and they're not good stories.
Suppose that in the world, everywhere, there are flying through us at very high speed a lot of particles that come equally in all directions. They're just shooting by, and once in a while hit us in a bombard. But we and the sun are practically transparent for them, nearly. But some hit, and so it's not completely transparent. Then look what would happen. If the sun is here...
Well, the idea of complete transparency, you can't think of it in those terms, because the fact is that we already know that if you hit an electron, okay, so the point would be is you could possibly, theoretically, absorb all of the gravity force. And so it sort of argues against the idea of a infinite gravity well. The whole singularity thing goes out the window, that there is a finite amount of this pressure in the universe. So that's another consequence that nobody talks about. And it's sort of a debunk of this idea of infinite mass. You just can't do it. It's always going to be a finite well, so you don't run into any singularity problems and any notions of having to create a singularity. But the simple argument I was going to make was, so the transparency argument. So the idea is that something would be made of a bunch of atoms, and the point is that gravity clearly acts as a nuclear force. If I just put one atom next to the Earth in orbit, it's going to move exactly in the same orbit as the Earth does. The sun's gravity will affect it exactly the same. It's velocity that determines your orbit. So it doesn't matter how big you are. It just matters what your velocity is. Velocity dictates where you orbit. Whether you're here or here or here or here. It's all just velocity. Mass is irrelevant. So if your velocity is right, that's where gravity is going to put you. So the Earth could be understood as just being a bunch of atoms that aren't even connected to each other. You could see it that way. And this force hits an object. Well, the point is that the force could be absorbed by this electron, and it gets hit by it and hit by it and hit by it and keeps accelerating. Well, it's going to accelerate into other electrons in the Earth. And so it's going to transfer the force, okay, by hitting the other electrons. So the momentum is what's really getting absorbed. So the momentum of the actual force could, in a sense, in some areas, be completely absorbed by the density of the Earth. But it wouldn't matter, because the force is constantly hitting anything moving slower than the speed of light. So all of the atom bits are being hit constantly by the force and being absorbed. So it's always essentially the same amount of force, and it's not really about transparency. It's just about the density of your atoms. And so that's why mass becomes relevant to how much gravity you can create. That is, how much of a shadow you cast on something else is going to be dictated by how many pieces of movable stuff there is inside of you, but the force itself, okay, is in effect just going to give pieces momentum. And obviously it's going to be doing it in both directions is the point. And, but whatever. And so you're essentially trapping this force moving the speed of light interacts with matter. The matter moves much slower, much less than the speed of light. And so the force doesn't get where it's going because it's stuck in here making the earth hot. And it ends up getting eventually re-radiated through thermal equilibrium, you could argue, in all directions. But it's clearly irrelevant to this object. When you radiate it in this direction, it's clearly this can't have anything to do with this. So clearly, the only stuff that's going to matter is the stuff that's going to hit you or interact with you. And the bottom line is there's still going to be a low pressure here in terms of an absence of interaction between the two.
And the Earth is here. Then, if the sun weren't here, there would be particles bombarding from all sides, giving little impulses by the rattle of these bang, bang, a few that hit, which would not shake the Earth in any particular direction, because there is many coming from one side as the other, from top, from bottom. However, when the sun is here, the particles which are coming in this direction are partly absorbed by the sun because some of them hit the sun and don't go through. Therefore, the number that are coming from this direction toward the...
And move the atoms in the sun. Let's just recognize that you can't kill the momentum. You can only trap it.
The Earth is less than the number that are coming from the other side, because here they have no opposition from no sun there. And it's easy to see, after some mental effort, that the further the sun is away, the less in proportion of all of the particles are being taken out of the possible directions in which particles can...
Right, so he could say the darker the shadow, right? The further away, the weaker the shadow, the closer, the darker the shadow gets. Inverse square law. Same as a light bulb, same as lots of things that are, you don't think of photons as being bent geodesics, okay? They're obeying the inverse square law from a light bulb. Same mechanism basically, and all you're saying is, all I'm suggesting to you is there's actually a lot more of those photons hitting us all the time. They're just invisible. The lights are on in the universe, more than just the lights you see.
Smaller, and in fact inversely is the square of the distance. So there will therefore be an impulse toward the sun on the Earth that's inversely as the square of the distance, and is the result of large numbers of very simple operations, just hits. One after the...
Yes, hits, just pushes, push. Push makes sense, pull doesn't make any sense. Pull is not an elemental function, it's just useless as a description, it's just incoherent, frankly. It's physically incoherent as elemental function.
The other from all directions. And therefore the strangeness of the mathematical relation will be very much reduced because the fundamental operation is much simpler than calculating the inverse of the square of the distance. This machine does the calculating.
So another shot at the notion that physics has to be math. Physics is a model. Their model is full of invisible magical functions. Fact. The model I'm suggesting is full of mechanical mechanisms with specific functions.
These particles bouncing.
Wow, guys, that was just amazing, right? Like, he explained it pretty freaking good, He set it up the way it needs to be set up, right? Yeah, let's keep watching.
Only trouble with it is that it doesn't work.
If you don't try, yes, at first glance you can find a problem, and then at second glance maybe you can alleviate that problem, but they never gave it a second glance.
For other reasons, Every theory that you make up has to be analyzed against all the possible consequences and to see if it predicts anything else.
Right, and your theory predicts I don't have to be accountable for anything because I'm using magical forces. I'm saying there's energy that isn't energy. Stuff moves for effectively no energy reason. There's no energy required to make the Earth move into the sun. There's no energy required to make two magnets move into each other. Nothing has to move the stuff. It's just moved by the idea of movement.
And this predicts something else. If the Earth is moving this way, more particles will hit it from the front than from the back. If you're running in the rain, more rain hits you from in the front of the face than in the back of the head because you're running into the rain. And so as the Earth is moving in this direction, it's running into the particles, rather, and running away from the ones that are chasing it from behind. So that more particles hit it from the front than from the back, and there would be a force also sideways whenever there was any motion. This sideways force would slow the Earth up in the orbit, and it certainly would not have lasted the at least 3 or 4 billion years that it has been going around the sun. So that's the end of that theory.
So again, it really isn't the end of anything. The sideways part, I guess, is he's saying you're going to hit more stuff moving in front from sideways directions. It's hard to say exactly what he meant by that one. But regardless, the point is if there is a right-hand rule, obviously you'd be expelling as much left as right, which would be a directionality imbalance in the end, and so that would be a give and take. And you can argue, in a sense, as Zohar does, that for every action forward, there's the opposite reaction of how you have to give it back. So anything you're collecting this way, you're giving something back the opposite way. And that would compensate it. I don't think it's that simple, but because I don't think the electron and proton actually do overcome drag. So their function doesn't create enough of a machine to maintain their velocity, where atomic structures, when you put something like a neutron, which is essentially just a hydrogen atom, a small one, a compressed one, with another electron or proton, then you create a machine that can travel through space with a velocity and without being dragged to death. And there's a physical mechanism that accounts for that.
But unfortunately, he basically just decided that he'll just dismiss the entire thing just because of a small problem that came up. And this is the...
Well, let's even call it a big problem. It doesn't matter. It's one problem. So it does everything. It works really well. It's called mock gravity. They teach it. They actually use it when they're explaining, Einstein's theory of relativity, because it creates the convergence, which they call an anti-divergence. It works really well. And so they just throw out the it works really well part. That's the baby, I would say. And, because there's a little bit of dirty bathwater, where they could have figured out how to wash this baby without destroying it.
Drag or the friction problem. So I actually mentioned this in my first video on this theory, right here, orbit, which sucks. It's kind of like there's also a lot of friction in my model. I mean, we can talk about friction in the actual universe, like moving through space. Maybe if Gary wants to talk about that.
Yeah, well, I don't need to talk about it because I don't believe electrons are orbiting protons, so I don't think that's happening. And again, this is an elemental physical. This is gravity is a nuclear force. It's affecting the nuclear bits. That's the first thing to understand. So modeling it as suns and earths isn't getting to the physics. So I'd argue you have to model it as electrons and protons to get to the physics. And they're not orbiting, in my opinion. No evidence requiring me to believe they do that. They're in fixed magnetic positions, and the magnetism is the force being trapped between them and all of the rest. You have to account for charge. And you have to account for the fact that there's a package called an atom. It's made of parts, and that those parts can have a configuration that allows it to maintain velocity, because for every action in one side, there's a commensurate action on the other side that makes it less likely to be affected by drag. It gets more, it becomes less massive in the direction it's moving, okay, as it moves.
But because Gary's actually the guy who's been defending this for the past 5 years, and he's actually made a response like 4 years ago to Richard Feynman, to this exact video, actually. Okay, guys, so real quick, we have to distinguish between what is matter and what isn't matter, all right? So the idea, what I'm going to say here is that basically matter is talking about a area where there's just way more force bits, okay? And the reason there's way more is probably a lot more complicated, and we're probably going to have to talk about that in future videos, because we're going to have to talk about magnetism, and there has to be a plus and a minus and all that stuff to make everything work out. For this video, we're going to just go as bare basic as we can and just talk about the criticism from Richard Feynman, okay? So
yeah, okay. So I don't know if we need to play all this. Like I said, I'll leave a link below. I agree with some, don't agree with all. And some of it's, yeah, I'd argue I don't wish to assert a final opinion. Even on subjects like the existence of the fact that electrons actually move through space. That they're what's being transferred when charge is being created. When I'm kind of going to argue, I think that all that's transferred is actually the force, the pressure, and the photons. The virtual photons are exchanged, but you can't exchange the electrons because they won't play along. But anyway, those are all details that, I think the basic concept can be understood, and that's all that needs to be understood, to just recognize that their evidence is not what they claim it to be. It's not a proof. They haven't demonstrated it beyond reasonable doubt. There's lots of reasons to doubt, and the fact that there exists a perfectly viable theory that just needs completion, that does everything, and does everything in a physical way, should be a glaring concern to anybody arrogantly saying we've done it, we've accomplished it, we already know how it works, when their model isn't complete. It requires you to believe in a bunch of magical functions. It's lousy. It's a God theory. It looks like religion. It's got so many wooey parts, and you have this viable evolution theory sitting next to it, and all you're doing is going, there's no missing links, there's no missing links. Well, yeah, the non-existence of all the transitional organisms is a glaring deficit, okay, in the fossil record. But as soon as you understand punctuated equilibrium, as soon as you understand that, well, evolution mostly happens in small groups, tiny groups even, family groups, all of the American Indians, from North America all the way to the bottom of South America, are genetically related, the argument is made, to 7 females. 7. That's where the evolution takes place, is in the small groups. Big groups don't change easily. They dampen all changes. They're more likely to destroy any aberrant. But the smaller you make the group, the more likely the aberrant is to succeed. And once you understand that, well, then you understand why the fossil record doesn't have a whole bunch of intermediate fossils. It's because those small groups didn't get fossilized. They didn't get Pompeyed. They didn't have the opportunity to become a fossil because there were so few of them. So evolution happens in very small numbers, and then the small numbers, once they become a gang again, they succeed. Then they become big enough to take on the other big tribe. They become a herd themselves, and their herd dominates the other herd and wipes them out. That's how evolution really works. And once you know that, you understand, oh, so that flaw isn't really a flaw in the theory. I can understand why. And again, they're not even trying to understand why drag might change depending on circumstances. They don't even want to give it a thought. They're just saying, no intermediate fossils, theory no good. That's all they're doing. It's right plain in your face. and you're going to sit there and obnoxiously tell me I'm a pseudoscientist, I hate science, I'm a fool, I'm an idiot. Well, then prove it with a statement, prove it with an experiment, prove it with some kind of evidence, except your assertion. If all you can do is make an assertion that you don't like me, you don't like what I'm saying, then you're being pathetic. You're so weak. So take the challenge up. I'll make a room for any one of you to, we can do a Skype conversation, and you can humiliate me with your great, brilliant understanding of reality. It's an open invitation to anybody who wishes to do so with some sort of reasonable discipline. And so take me up on it. You can't find one single defender of your standard model who's willing to argue it. I mean, the very fact that these videos are so easy to make, and response videos are so easy to make, how come you can't make any with a rational argument instead of just insults? How come you can't do it? So, enough of the video. And such. So, till the next time. So forth and whatnot.